So now let me introduce our next set of let me introduce our next set of presenters. Um, so you we this is exciting. Aleandra Pinder, Brandon Isome. Look, Emily Carr popping on. God bless you. Okay. Um, um, where did she go? There she goes. All right. Right, so we have a very special moment here today. Um, Let me just introduce each person, and then I will turn it over to Shannon Shelley-Tremblay. Um, Sh Shannon, um, Shannon was my. I met Shannon through Dr. Ellen Buckner, who I call my dear sister Ellen. Um, and she invited she came she annually she comes to Tuskegee with her students. And one year, I think it was during the pandemic, and I said, well, I would like to come to your school. And I had my son Jonathan with me because he's looking at schools. I'd like to come to your school so we could actually let us see the campus and so on. And we had a wow of a time. And she took us to a place, a restaurant up on a hill, and it was amazing. And one of the students there is now a MPH slash JD student at Emory University. So when I was at Emory presenting a couple weeks ago, she was there. So we continue to build these connections. But anyway, so Dr. Buckner said, I have a wonderful person for you who could help you with grants and grant writing. And everybody always has a wonderful person, right? My doctor's the best doctor. My lawyer's the best lawyer, right? Everybody, my pastor's the best pastor ever. When I met Shannon, I knew for darn sure she was the GOAT. She is the GOAT. And I like working with goats because I like working with the best, because people who are thorough, because oh my God, she's thorough. And so, Shannon, I just want to tell you, love you, love you, love you, and I appreciate you so much because even when I'm not thinking about what I'm thinking about, you're thinking about us. So I am deeply appreciative for the work that you have done at the National Center and putting together the beginning of that big grant that we're trying to secure and others that we're going to do. So Shannon Shelley-Tremblay, she's an attorney by training, and so I will let her say anything else about herself when she's on. Secondly, I would like to this gentleman, Brandon Isom. He has so many degrees it will choke you. Okay. As a matter of fact, I think he got his EDS from up by Dr. Ellen Buckner at Sanford. Yeah. So, but I met Dr. Isom, but he was introduced to us at the National Center from Dr. Regan Sparrow when we were looking for a Merck postdoc fellow to work on the Public Health Ethics Manual. And so we interviewed a few people, and Brandon Isom, we just were just so challenged because between three of the people, one was Juanetta Wimbley, who, by the way, is presenting, was done at Tuskegee Institute Middle School today, and Brandon Isom. And Brandon eventually came to work for us and did just some marvelous, marvelous job. We just bonded as brothers, right? Just bonded as brothers. I just love this guy. And so he had just finished his D.Min, and we would just, Brandon, you got a PhD mentality. You need to go do that thing. In other words, when I say by a PhD mentality, I mean this. You need to be putting yourself in a position where somebody could kick you behind, where a group of seven or others will beat the living daylights out of you until when it's all over, you're mad at the world. But then you are so trained that you could actually impact the world. And so now we have a newly minted Van Hyssop, and he's finished his PhD. It seems like he just got started yesterday, and he's finished his PhD. He did all of this stuff, and now we're just celebrating him. So he went to University of Georgia, did that, a doctor of ministry from Interdenominational Theological Center, Ed Specs from Stanford, as I mentioned. And so Brandon, we just welcome you today. His degree is in educational policy, but however, Do not allow that to think that that's all he does. He is a theologian. He is the whole gamut, right? And just like Wanda Wilson, she's a theologian too. So they do the whole gamut. So I expect whatever question we could come up at the end, they will be able to respond. Okay. And then the person, and I kept her as my final person of introduction for a reason, um, because she happens to have the uniqueness of being um, the student of both of David Hodge, Nathaniel Holmes, and I'm not sure of Gwen West, but at least they were conversation partners. But Aleandra Pinder, I got to tell you this, and then I'm gonna just unleash. She was in my intro to philosophy class, or intro to I think it was intro to philosophy, and she was a pain in the behind. Oh my God, she was hilarious. She was funny, but she was trying to laugh her way through school. And I'm like, what the world? And then her father is a bishop. That just made it each worse. And then here's the part that got me, Shannon. She said that she's not a Christian and she's not saved. I said, your daddy's a bishop. You are saved by that. So anyway, she left Florida Memorial and she didn't come back the next semester. So I went on Facebook or wherever and I tracked it down and I found her. I said, why are you in school? She said, well, I'm done with that. I'm done. I'm not coming back. I said, okay, that's nice. Now, here's what I got to say about that. Don't tell me any foolishness. I used some choice language. And she came back and she gave us hell and she got her bachelor's degree majoring in religion and philosophy, I think science and what's the other thing over there? And physical education. All of this. And like she didn't want to leave us. And she never listened to what I had to say. I said, do not run for senior class president or senior something. She didn't listen. She said, but Dr. Hyde, there's a scholarship involved. I said, I don't do it. She ran and she won. I said, don't do this. She did it. She's always saying that. Let me tell you, this is the most blessed young person I've ever met in my life. Now, wait, listen, I know it's so excited because I'm telling you, she's special. She actually, what did she do next that was just insane? Um, she started this thing while she was a student, Shannon, as a student where she would teach students how to get funding in the Bahamas. She's from the Bahamas. How to get funding, how to get accepted, how to do all of this, how to pass it on. She was doing all of this stuff. And you know what? Listen to me. Listen, I'm about to say something to blow your mind. Lachlan, over 1,000 students have gone on to the United States from the Bahamas and that region to get fully funded education because of this young lady. And while she was then she started teaching. She started teaching in the public school system, which I couldn't see happening because she looked like she'll beat those students. But nevertheless, she started teaching in the public school system. And at the same time she did that, she did her master's degree in from Florida Memorial. Now, while she was doing that, by the way, I think I ought to tell you, she took a logic class with me, and she scored the highest grade in logic in these two schools where I was teaching logic. Now, this is the person who claims that she can't read and write too well. Okay, there you go. Okay, now finally, she got accepted to Colorado State University, where she is now at the end of for completing her Ph.D. in education, something or the other. But her dissertation, her graduate work and her presentation, she just wrote a paper, and I'm sure she could share more about it when that moment comes. But she just wrote a paper, Shannon, about the way in the unfairness in terms of immigration and so on, about how island students are massive contributors, but how they're denied massive access from everything from jobs to healthcare to the whole gamut. And so that's why I asked her to speak to this because she is the rising goat in these kinds of conversation. So I turn it over to you, Shannon, and we present to you Dr. Brandon Isom and soon to be Dr. Aleandra Pinder to present to us. Dr. Shannon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Hodge. And I'm just thrilled to be able to talk with and share some ideas with all of you and talk with my distinguished colleagues. Dr. Isome and Ms. Pinder, and also my sister in school. I have a degree from Colorado State University, and we discovered that ourselves recently. So just thrilled that we have that connection as well. Wanted to tell you a little bit about how we got started and lay out. Usually moderators don't do this much talking, but I'm going to give a little bit of a framework for where we start so that it doesn't seem so out of the blue. And I also want to say that I just have really appreciated all the conversations I've been able to be a part of. The one I just was able to sit through. Thank you so much for all of that. So much ties to what we're about to discuss. And what Dr. Wilson, what you talked about was so important and so critical to the work of the National Center and more broadly to where we are as a nation and where we want to go, I hope. So thank you for that. I also was able to sit in on some yesterday, and some of the work around, specifically around AI, also informs what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to take a few minutes and talk. Then the next person who will speak will be Dr. Isome, and he's going to give us a framework for our context, which is DEI, and we'll go further in that. So history and a framework context. And then Ms. Pinder is going to round us out in terms of presentation, looking really at the current impact of DEI policies in the educational framework. And then we're going to have a conversation with you all. We all offer that if you at any point have any questions, please jump in, and we will find ways throughout the conversation to pull in what you ask. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time to talk as well. So to start with, I'm going to share my screen and tell you why I'm even here, because how often do you actually hear that a grant writer get asked to give a presentation in such an important and important setting as an institute like this? And how often does a grant writer, a person like me, get asked to talk about something like education and policy? Well, a little bit of around me. I am a licensed educator. I've taught at the K-12 level. I've also taught in the university level, and I'm also an attorney. My work has been framed around justice and around how justice, policy, and education come together, how we as a community work together to try to improve our lives through the lens of moving toward more justice and more equity, more inclusion, and really ultimately more belonging. So today, our focus is on ethics and education, ethics in the framework of education policy and DE&I. And also I added the sometimes B because for many of us, we're talking a lot about belonging in this context. Why did this come up? About probably 2 weeks ago, no, about a month ago, something occurred in the state of Alabama. I'm sorry, let me make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Okay. Something occurred in the state of Alabama, and I came to Dr. Hodge with it because I was frustrated. But I want to let you know how we're framing our conversation today. So first, we're going to talk about what are the issues, both historical issues and what's happening today, and then what are some possible solutions. And in addition, we're going to consider some additional foci in this conversation. And the reason we're going to do that, let me step back here, sorry. I'm looking at too many things. All right. The reason we need to look at those additional foci again is we want to talk about the history and the development of DEI and education policies. We want to really consider the impacts of those policies and the ways that we approach those policies, the assumptions that we make around those policies, and the ways that those practices impact various groups of individuals and why that's important. We also want to consider through this lens of what we've been talking about all week around the culture of care, how we really challenge our assumptions, identify our assumptions around and the relevance and connection of those. And in this case, we're going to talk specifically about another topic, and that is AI, to kind of bring it home to some of what we have to grapple with right here in the United States, right here across the planet, and right here at the center. So we're going to use AI to begin this conversation. And then also, we're going to talk a little bit about how we can incorporate new ways of thinking about DEI and J policies in our planning for teaching others about this kind of a topic. So for specifically using AI to think about how do we, in the educational context, approach these important issues? And then within the educational context, and then across our spheres of influence within our fields and within our communities. So this topic that came up, and the reason that it came up specifically recently, is that in the state of Alabama and across the nation, but specifically in the state of Alabama, on March 20th, the governor of the state of Alabama, as many of us know on this call, signed a bill banning the use of state funding for any DEI efforts within any educational settings across the state. And so one of the things we were talking about, Dr. Hodge and I were talking about, was what kind of implications does that have for our work at the center? We sit in the state of Alabama. We have to grapple with these kinds of issues. What does it mean for us as we go forward, thinking about how are we going to approach our work? How are we going to approach the work that we're planning to do? How are we going to approach the questions of ethics that are so critical across communities, across various needs and efforts and focuses, and so forth? And then what are the implications for bioethics generally in a context of a state and nation where this question has come up? What are the implications for education generally? And then back to what I said before, we're going to talk specifically about AI, since it is a STEM area that is implicated in the practice of and the use of DEI. So there were many people who brought this law forward across the state of Alabama. And then there were many people who were opposed to this law. And there were actions that occurred both at the Capitol and across the state in both cases to seek the governor's favor or disfavor. And ultimately, the voices of those who wanted this policy to go forward were those that won the day. It was passed in the state, and she signed it into law on the 20th. So in this case, why this education policy? Why did this education policy become an education policy that traveled through a state in the United States? Why is it an education policy that actually is being put forward across the nation? There are many states that have had similar bills passed or are trying to pass similar bills. Why is this kind of policy happening? Was a question that I wanted to ask. And the reason I wanted to ask it is because I think that if we understand the purpose behind education policy, how we get to these education policies, then we can do a few things. We can determine how we're going to work within them. We're going to determine what we need to do to address concerns or issues that these kinds of policies bring up. And in particular, in this case, DE and I, and J and B. And so I did a little bit of looking to try to discover, well, what are the reasons for, and what were the intentions behind the individuals who pushed this law forward, created it in Alabama, and were successful in getting it passed and made into a policy that will be implemented in the state starting October 1. So a few of the quotes that came from different parts of the country and different places where this kind of policy has been either implemented or is being implemented include concerns about promulgating ideology that pits students against one another, and specifically race-based ideology, that DEI is incompatible with this idea of free expression, which is fundamental to education, that DEI offices, policies, and trainings actually stop free speech on campuses, and specifically college campuses, and that DEI promotes underserving people who advance because they check a box, or advance because they check a box. So these are specific philosophies behind the things that people have said are the reasons why they are pushing these and have pushed these kinds of policies. This is one very controversial type of policy, but it's one that helps us to really consider. So another theme that was throughout a lot of the research that I looked at was a concern around the feeling of the learner if they're exposed to DEI and J information through these different lenses: historical, political, artistic, point of view, personal experience, and so forth. And also a concern that a learner might cause suffering, experience guilt or pain by learning about the actions, decisions, or behaviors of other people. So there are concerns and there were beliefs behind why and how this particular policy was created in Alabama. And in fact, the governor herself made a statement around what Alabama itself's position was and the government of Alabama. In fact, she stated that Alabama values rich diversity, but was concerned about, quote, bad actors. So, in looking at all of this, a few things came to mind for me and things that I'd like us to consider as we talk through the rest of this session. And one of them is really a question around what does inclusion look like? And I've heard us talk about over several sessions, what is our vision? Vision for, in this case, inclusion, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are the values implicated when we talk about an education policy like implementing DEI and J policies, or barring the existence of those, or shaping what's allowed or what isn't? So what are the values implicated in those decisions? What methods then, when we're talking about policy isn't just something out in the clouds somewhere. It's really got real world implications for how they're implemented, and when they're implemented, how they will impact people and how that impact will be assessed. And then what consequences will there be for failing to or for implementing a policy? And then what are our individual and community responsibilities? Again, in the context of this particular policy, but really more broadly, DEI policies are one that is so critical to look at in this case, this one in Alabama. So looking then more closely at the connection between DEI and J and artificial intelligence, and how they intersect and how they might be implicated when we talk in a policy context. One thing that's important, this is just one of many bits of or areas that people are considering and really asking us as learners across the field of education in particular, is to really, that AI challenges us to consider both the ethical and DEI implication responsibilities of its use. So just like so much, we've learned so much about a variety of tools, a variety of approaches to inquiry, from science to history to political science to all the social sciences and to the arts and so forth. AI is yet another way of as a tool that we use and a way that we are advancing our cultures and our world. So in the context of AI, those who are doing this work understand that the ethical and DEI implications are strong and need to be considered. They also help us to really think about a framework. So many times when we talk about DEI and J, we use frameworks. We consider a variety of ways of thinking about equity, about justice, and how we determine where we sit as a group, as an individual, as a society, as a community, along the spectrum of how inclusive are we, how equitable are we, do we have diverse voices? Do we have diverse experiences as part of what we're learning about, and who we include in our planning processes for implementing policies and so forth? And so often we choose either consciously or unconsciously metaphors, and then how do we work with those in the context of AI? And I think that this kind of thing is very, very important, because if we don't ask the question of the tools that we're using, we don't ask the question of the content that we're working with. So for example, if we are teaching young people how to use AI, but we're not helping them to understand that the inputs, the assumptions we make consciously and unconsciously, the metaphors we use will actually shape our use of those tools, then what will that mean? What will the implications be? So for example, what questions are we asking of ourselves, of our institutions, and then what questions of our leaders around the context of policies like DEI in the context of AI and in other ways? And what aren't we asking? What should we be asking? So back to the metaphor question, I think many of you probably recognize the idea of, does everyone have a seat at the table, as a question around, are we being equitable in the way that we approach things? Or perhaps, as I already mentioned, does everyone have a voice in the room? Are all voices able to be heard, and heard at a level that means that everyone's equally considered? Or perhaps a metaphor we use is, maybe, do we think in terms of, do we all get a piece of the pie, right? And then that question around, how does that metaphorical framework impact our decisions or the effort that we're making, what we care about and our focus of our work, and what we will and won't challenge, so in the advocacy space? And these are all areas of concern and discussion as we move forward as a national center. What are the decisions we're making about our effort? What are we caring about from a focus standpoint? And what we will and we and not will we challenge and what won't we challenge? So, and then how do these metaphorical frameworks, how do they actually limit our research and or educational practices? So then the last thing I'd like to say before we jump to Dr. Isome, and he's going to talk with us in a historical way, is I'm going to show you a couple of things. So how does our metaphorical framework limit our research and educational practices is one question. But what instead, if we ask different questions, how might that help us to really think about these things in a new way? So what if we ask different questions about the images, ideas, concepts being generated in the classroom and or in an AI, and the approaches we're taking to dealing with and grappling with ideas, the technologies, the tools, et cetera, and everything that in the ways that they impact us. So for example, if we consider what frame was chosen and how does this frame, what does it suggest to us? Who is the person that we're looking at if we're talking about? And in this case, I'm about to show you some first some not AI, but then some AI in just a minute. What do we feel when we see this person? How is what we're seeing, how do we recognize them? What are they feeling? So talking about from an empathy perspective, not only our own feelings, but those feelings of others. And how does what's being featured through the lens of something generated, either by a technological source like AI or an individual source like a teacher in a classroom. And how does what's being featured impact the person or not? And what does the image creator or provider want us to think about? And why was this person featured? So in that case, this question then looks at this image. So I'll let you take a look at it for a second and just ask yourself a few of those questions. Why was this frame chosen by me, the creator of this space? What does the frame suggest to us? Who is this person? Do we recognize them? And so forth. So let's ask that again. Same questions. So what frame was chosen? What does this frame suggest to us? Who is this person? What do we feel when we see this person? Do we recognize them or not? So forth. Once again, so this is the second photo or second image. And one more time. So what frame was chosen here? And what does this frame suggest to us? Who are these people? What do we feel when we see those people and so forth? As many of you probably recognize, this is Titus Kafar's 2014 piece that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. What I took were slices of that photo, right? Ask you to think about those questions. Well, this is what AI does. This is what the algorithms do. They just do them a whole lot faster and a whole lot smarter than someone like me would do. But it's also what we as educators do, whether we're educating in the context of a STEM background or in a practical context. I'm a lawyer. If I'm educating future lawyers or current lawyers, or for those of us who are educating in the hard sciences or in one of the other disciplines, all of that is the case. We're all picking and choosing what we're focused on, how we're advocating, how we're thinking about it, and what then that says to those who are learning from us, just as AI is. So what if we then ask those questions that I asked before? So I pulled those images of the DEI metaphor out, and I asked the exact same questions of a generator that is a free junky generator, but one that I know my children use, who are all teenagers, called GenCraft. So the first prompt I used, if you remember a second ago, was a question of what happens when everyone has a seat at the table. And what I'm about to show you are the images, the only image, I only did one for each one, the images that popped up for each of these questions. So here we go. Here's the first image. So that was the question about when everyone has a seat at the table. The next one was a question. It said, when everyone has a voice, when everyone's voice is heard. Notice what AI generated in that space. And the last one was interesting. It gave me not one, but two images. And that question was when everyone has a piece of the pie. So it gave us these two images, the one at the right and the left. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute. I wanted to explain how we got here. So you've heard how we got landed on this topic today. And so now we're going to go forward and we're going to hear from Dr. Isome about his, he has a broad and important historical understanding of how DEI has developed as a way of framing and how DEI policies have come to be in the United States and how we've gotten to where we are today and how important that is. And then we'll come back and talk with with Ms. Pinder, who's about to be Dr. Pinder next. So Dr. Isome, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Thank you. I thoroughly appreciated that conversation that you led with, because it feeds into this historical frame. And so essentially what I am arguing in my presentation is, one of the questions is, what is the frame? From a historical lens, I'm arguing that frame is an anti-Black frame. And even when you look at the AI generated images, they are all non-people of color. They are not Black and brown images when you're talking about who has a seat at the table. And so that's feeds very neatly into the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. And can you see that? Okay. So essentially what I want to argue from a historical perspective is that, and this even goes back to the conversation that Dr. Wilson posed about the humanization and humility of policy. And what I want to argue is that you cannot have a humane policy that is rooted in anti-Blackness until you first come to terms with your biases and your prejudices. And that means that from a historical perspective, we need to have some uncomfortable conversations. But as you just heard, what does that look like when policies limit those type of conversation, particularly around DEI and these divisive concepts? And so these are kind of some of the objectives that I really want to cover within this session. I initially wanted to show a YouTube image, but I decided that I wasn't going to show it because it was very graphic. But what happened in the YouTube image is that the YouTuber takes Lauryn Hill's lyrics "Black Rage" and puts it to historical images that kind of bolsters this concept of anti-Blackness. And so I'll provide the link later on so that you can watch it at your own discretion if that's what you want to do. But I'm coming from this notion of critical race theory as a theoretical grounding. And you see what Lauryn Hill says about Black rage is founded on 2/3 a person, rapings and beatings and sufferings that worsen, Black human packages tied up in strings. Black rage can come from all these kinds of things. Black rage is founded on blatant denial, squeeze economics, substance survival, deafening silence, and social control. Black rage is founded on wounds to the soul. And when we hear these conversations about critical race theory, these are some of the things that I want you to understand about critical race theory, is that it's a theoretical framework which allows you to evaluate the role of racism, and how racism is embedded in our policies and our practices, and then how it produces these types of inequalities. And so there is a direct correlation between the policies that we see and anti-Blackness. And so I think the question was posed as it relates to this frame. It's not intended for us to have a seat at the table. It never was, because it was rooted in anti-Blackness. And the main thing that I want to push here is that, and Dr. Hodge talked about this when he spoke about James Cone, the theologian who starts from a bottom-up approach to theologizing as opposed to a top-down. And I want to use this same notion with CRT. Oftentimes what we think of is that the academy came up with critical race theories with Derek Bell and some of the other legal scholars in the 70s. But Black folks were doing CRT before Derek Bell even got a hold of her, or before it ever even entered the academy. And so there were certain things that Black people were having conversations with their kids historically and currently about things that you can or cannot do. We saw that very explicitly during the Black Lives Matter movement, with a lot of instances of police brutality. Black people were then having what some social scientists and scholars call the talk, what to do if a police pulls you over. But these are conversations that Black people have always had with their kids, whether it was during the Jim and Jane Crow era, whether it was during enslavement. Like history shows that parents were having these types of conversations. So I'm doing two things here. One, I'm kind of giving a historical overview of different policies and how they kind of create this frame of anti-Blackness. But I'm also being intentional about disrupting a deficit perspective about Black family engagement. And because my research centers in Black family engagement, what you will see is that within all these policies, you have Black families that are pushing these policies. So here are some of the ethical dilemmas that you see in education. And education is very, very broad. And of course, I could not name all of the ethical dilemmas that you see, but these are just some of them. And I want to focus specifically on this notion of school choice, and to show you how some of the historical policies that we see feed into this school choice. And so when we hear the language now, we hear school choice, but what we don't hear is the racism that's embedded in that type of language and policy, right? And so just because you don't, race isn't explicitly mentioned, or you don't see those things, doesn't mean that it's not embedded within the policies within themselves. So this is how I kind of want to move with a policy overview. I want to kind of dive into Plessy versus Ferguson a little bit, Brown versus Board of Education, and that's split two ways, Brown 1 and Brown 2. And then this notion of this policy of Griffin versus County School Board of Education in Prince Edward County. And I'm sure we heard of most of these policies, at least with Plessy and Brown. So what was Plessy? Homer Plessy was a shoemaker and activist who collaborated, coordinated with an organization during that era to challenge the 1890 Louisiana Separate Car Act. And you will hear me ask towards the end, who creates policy, right? And we see within this instance that the legislation, state legislators are creating anti-Black policies. So they are creating these policies, these laws that are explicitly designed to do something very specific. And that was to separate according to these things. And so there are different challenges that went through, legal cases that went through. And eventually what happens is, after going through so many different types of litigations on the state, the district level, it makes its way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court issues a ruling that establishes this legal doctrine of separate but equal, right? And that kind of feeds into the Jim and Jane Crow era. And so what happens is this becomes the law of the land. And so Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, is in place, right? But again, Black people are constantly wrestling with the Constitution, right? They understand that it does not include them, but they're still going to wrestle with it to include themselves, right? And so it may see them as 2/3 of a person, but because they see themselves, or they are affirming their humanity, then they're willing to wrestle with this document, right? And so what happens is the NAACP begins to start to use different court cases to challenge this notion of separate but equal, right? And oftentimes what we hear is we hear about Brown versus Board of Education, But what we don't see is that the NAACP was very intentional about building the momentum that led up to Brown versus Board of Education. And so these are some cases that you see that kind of built up to that historical moment in 1954. And then eventually what happens is Black people, again, they are wrestling with these concepts. They're wrestling with the Constitution. They are unwilling to allow the souls of their children to be tainted by race and racism. They are unwilling to allow their kids to feel as if they are inferior because of the color of their skin, and they begin to challenge cases, right? And so what happens is all of these different cases, Davis versus Board, Briggs, Elliott, all of these are individual cases that Black families use to kind of challenge this notion of separate but equal, right? And so these cases are similar in the sense that it challenges racial segregation in public schools, but they are each designed to challenge something specific about what was going on in the schools at that time, whether it was not being able to be admitted into white schools, or they're in underfunded schools that are dilapidated or under-resourced and just falling apart. And so there are different court cases. And so what happens is all of these cases get combined, and then it becomes what we know historically, Brown versus Board of Education. And what the NAACP did through Thurgood Marshall is they use the Section 1 of the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause, to challenge this legal doctrine of separate versus equal. And you see that in the 14th Amendment, right? And so then the Supreme Court issues a ruling. They rule unanimously in favor of Brown, and that it's unconstitutional to have racially segregated schools, right? And oftentimes what happens is we think that was the end of it, but it really wasn't, because when the Supreme Court issued this ruling, a lot of school districts, a lot of communities, they were very intentional and strategic in their attempts to avoid integration. So the Supreme Court issues this ruling, and a lot of people say, we aren't going to follow this. We don't care what the court says. They're not going to change our Southern way of life and how we've become accustomed to doing things. And so now the Supreme Court, a year later, has to take this issue back up. And that is what you have, what we call Brown 2, right? And within this, what the court had to grapple with in Brown 2 was, what are the implications of school desegregation? So we said that it's unconstitutional to have racially segregated school, but what does that look like? How do you desegregate schools? When should school districts start desegregating schools, right? So a lot of these ethical questions are coming up, right? And essentially, what the Supreme Court does is they kind of punt it back out. So they say, you know what, we're not going to get involved in the implementation of desegregation. We're just going to rule that it's unconstitutional, but we're going to send it back down to the lower courts and let them decide how best to implement school desegregation and the pace of that and all of those things that came with it. So the Supreme Court didn't do anything Brown 2. So what happened was, after Brown 1 is issued, these school districts are being intentional about finding creative strategies to avoid integration. And this is one of the instances where a school district was very intentional about saying, we aren't going to integrate our schools, right? And so the Supreme Court, as I said, they kick it back down to the lower courts. And what Prince Edward County in Virginia did was they said that we're going to introduce a policy. And this policy, we're going to call it school choice. right? And you hear a lot of school choice policies starting to come up now. Again, just because it doesn't have racist language doesn't mean that it's not embedded in racism, right? And so then what are the ethical dilemmas that we wrestle with and confront in policies such as school choice, right? And so the school district implements this school choice policy that says, you know what, since we don't want to integrate all of these families, you can choose to go to whatever school you want to. And then they start telling the parents where to place their schools, right? In addition to that, they close all of the public schools and then they open up these private schools, right? So send your kids to these private schools. We're going to shut down public education. There will be no public education. And then we will redistribute state funds that were intentionally initially designed for public schools. We will then reallocate those funds and send it to private schools, right? And it will be up under the banner of school choice, right? And so that's essentially what happened. Whites at the time, they took their kids out of the public schools, they enrolled into these private schools. They shifted the state's public fund to these private schools, and as a result, blacks in Prince Edward County did not receive a formal education from 1959 through 1963 because the public schools were closed. Now, again, this is no different than the anti-literacy laws that were in place in the previous generation that prohibited blacks from acquiring a formal education, from learning how to read and write. Again, a different policy that's designed to do the same thing, right? As the anti-literacy laws, it just looks a little different. And so there is this tension between private and public education. It eventually goes to the Supreme Court. They go through different litigations with that. One court sides with it, they reverse it. And then this lays the foundation for our current school voucher programs and school choice. So if I'm good with time, I want to play this short clip. Let me know if you can see it. I may have to stop and reshare.
I mean, just breaking videos came out over the past.
Can you see that and hear that? Okay,
Yes.
cool.
Couple of months from Accuracy in Media finding that the public school employees in red states, including Ohio, Idaho, Iowa, and Tennessee, some of these states having CRT bans already, the administrators and school employees are sitting there flat out saying that they're just going to skirt the law and do whatever they want anyway, and they could just change the language. Instead of calling it CRT, they'll move to call it social emotional learning, or they'll call it student mental health services. They'll trick the parents, they've been caught saying on video in places like Utah. So the better solution is from the bottom up, allowing families to choose the schools that best meet their needs and align with their values. That should also provide competition for the public schools to focus on education as opposed to indoctrination. I was saying all along before this year even started, all eyes on Iowa, and I was right. It was the first government school monopoly domino to fall this year. Utah coming just a couple of days after Iowa. But if you're looking at states, the most realistic ones for this to happen, to unleash education freedom, is to look at states that have GOP trifectas, where there's a Republican in the governor's office and in each chamber, the House and the Senate. It's the most likely to happen in those states. So I'm keeping my eyes open, looking at Arkansas right now. Nebraska has a bill that's backed by the governor, introduced by Senator Linehan, has 31 co-sponsors. In Nebraska, they need a 2/3 supermajority to pass bills through their unicameral legislature to overcome a filibuster. They need 33 votes. They already have 31 co-sponsors in Nebraska. It seems like Nebraska will finally get school choice for the first time this year. Look at Ohio and Indiana. Ohio's governor, DeWine, just did a State of the State address calling for a 60% increase in the eligibility for their state scholarship program, the Ed Choice Scholarship Program in Ohio. Indiana, Wyoming, just their Senate just passed the universal school choice bill for all families, regardless of income. And that already passed one chamber. It has, I believe, 44 co-sponsors on that bill. South Carolina Senate just passed an education savings account bill. Not universal, but it's pretty expansive, and it's a huge step in the right direction. Other red states, Oklahoma, Governor Stitt has been a huge proponent of school choice all along. I think they might be able to get it across the finish line this year in Oklahoma. And in Texas, I live in Texas now, and Governor Abbott has been making his most forceful support of school choice that I've ever seen on the campaign trail. Abbott even pointed out that this would be the most powerful push for school choice in Texas history. I believe him, and it's happening right before our eyes right now. And in a recent event, Greg Abbott said that he explicitly called for a universal education savings account. So Texas might be able to get it done this year as well. The teachers unions must be terrified right now. They're losing control over other people's kids. They're losing control over other people's children's minds, and they're freaking out. And it's great because the socialists that defend the government school system, although they believe that your children are theirs, that's not the truth. Parents know best for their kids, and they are the ones that should direct their children's education.
So the argument with this school choice thing that I'm putting forth or seeking to advance is that school choice has roots in anti-Blackness, school segregation, inequitable funding, and white flight. And so it sounds good to say parents know what is best for their child's education. It sounds good to say that parents should be able to choose and have a say so in all of these things. But what is interesting to me is that no one goes to the medical doctor and says that as a patient, you know what is best, not the doctor. But in this instance, teachers don't know what is best. Parents know what is best, right? And so what I end with is, what then is the purpose of education? And as we grapple with that, you have to understand that education is not a federal right. There's no federal right to education. When you look at the Constitution does not speak to education. So education is a state issue, right? So there are some policies, there are some federal policies that dictate what schools can or cannot do. And you see some of those policies listed. But again, education is primarily a state issue, right? And if you click on this link, which I can provide to you later, it pulls up a list of all these different states and what all these states say about education, right? Because for each state, they get to dictate and define what education is for them, right? And so when you're thinking about policy, what I want you to think about is that educational policy happens in many different ways. It happens in classrooms. It happens on the school level. It happens on the district level. It happens on the state level. And there are some educational policies that happen on the federal level, right? So I will end by saying there's always been two different understandings of education. The traditional Jeffersonian view of education, coming from Thomas Jefferson on up, is that education should teach us how to become good citizens, right? And we know that public education has existed since colonial times, and but it's also rooted in anti-Blackness, because at those times, Black were excluded from getting formal education. Education was primarily applied to the laboring class, that only those who worked within a certain field could get the education. It excluded women. Like, we know these things historically, right? But what happened is, during the Reconstruction era, when Blacks got a hold of education, because they had this insatiable appetite for education, right? They transformed education into something totally different from this notion of education and citizenship. And for Black people, education became synonymous with social change and liberation, right? And so it shifted from education and citizenship with this Jeffersonian anti-Black view. And for Blacks, it became about education, then equips you with the knowledge that you need to be able to make change or to create liberating spaces. And so I would kind of end on that note.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We appreciate the frame, and we'll bring you back for conversation after we hear from Ms. Pender, who's going to talk even more about this important topic and the current context of exactly what we've heard from Dr. Isome. So thank you. I think I'm having trouble hearing you, Ms. Pender. Is anyone else having trouble? Can you hear
now?
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And today I'm going to do a little different. And thank you all for being able to display everything, because I was making sure I capture my notes. In my earlier years, when I heard the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would often be excited because, I was under the impression that my identity would mean something in this country. But through my various experiences of this phrase, I began to realize that this was for me, not for everybody. I'm going to start off with anecdotal experiences first, that they were buzzwords. I was so determined to find out what this truly meant, that what these words truly meant, that I attended dozens of diversity workshops, people with the topics dealing with various racial matters and so on. Many of these workshops spoke about the micro and macro aggression of what it means not to touch a Black woman's hair, not believing that all Muslims are cruel people, not thinking all Asian students were going to be engineers and doctors, speaking on topics of LGBTQ people and the community, how my Blackness should not offend someone, and how white people needed to be educated on how to treat people that were minority. While these conversations are all important, and none of it should ever be eliminated from the topics and teaching someone how to treat people and getting to the historical root of the ongoing problems that we see in America. I quickly noticed that a lot of the conversations and topics that were being talked about in the workshop was very surface level. To further investigate this new trend of the diversity statements of many universities at both HBCUs and PWIs, and generally on every website, I saw a statement that goes something like this. I won't call a specific name. I'm just creating an average statement that I would have seen. The university is committed to embracing diversity through the inclusion of individuals reflective of characteristics such as age, culture, different ideas and perspectives, disability, ethnicity, first generation status, family status, gender identity and expression, geographic background, marital status, national origin, race, religious, spiritual beliefs, sex, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, physical appearance, medical diagnosis, documentation of status, and veteran statuses, with special attention given to populations of historically underrepresented or included from participation in higher education. This was awesome to see that it was painted all over the university websites. It was great to see that it was talked about in workshops. It was great to see that it was on the newspapers, social media, and other media platforms that were outraged between the two dominant media groups, which I would have found to be Fox and CNN. But this is my story. I originally came from the Bahamas at the age of 18, where my parents dropped me off to college at the only HBCU in South Florida. This college was no stranger to my parents because I had cousins that had attended, and it was highly populated with Afro-Caribbean international students and African international students. Many of us would only mingle with people from our culture and did not have the full understanding of what it meant to be at an HBCU, or actually the importance of that. Before I state my experience, I'd like to state that I am grateful for my former professors at this institution and the staff because they did play a pivotal role that shaped me into the person I am today. While being at this institution, we were taught the value of what it meant for Black students to attend an HBCU, something I wore proudly. Many of the conversations within this community stated that PWIs would not understand who we are. It would take affirmative action to get us into the admissions, through the admissions process. We would face a variety of discrimination, all of what we were afraid of. I had never been discriminated at all during this time because I came from a country where everything was basically predominantly Black. My schools were Black, my hospitals were free, and the nurses was Black, the doctors were Black. My prime minister was Black, and my parents, who were pastors, were also Black and had a Black membership. The only thing I knew about America was watching Family Matters, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Full House, and Saved by the Bell, and hoping that one day, whenever I get to America, I would be able to also have a school locker, something I'm still waiting on. But this fairy tale would fade away quickly. During my first class of multicultural diversity in my freshman year, I had a Haitian American professor who asked us to do a project on our backgrounds. I was excited because I got to tell the story of my country. I said confidently, I am Aleandra from the Bahamas, where Christopher Columbus found my country in 1492. I couldn't even finish the rest of the presentation because this professor stopped me and said, no, he did not, and explained why. He said, Aleandra, I'm going to help you learn the true history of your country. But one day you will also have to understand with the historical reference of what it means to be in America. At this time, I did not know what it meant. But as the years went by, I understood. See, when I got to America, my parents were paying a school fee of $22,000 because, of course, I went to a private school where I did not even know what it meant, what it was like initially to have a scholarship. I was unable to obtain a student loan because at that point I was not an American citizen or a permanent resident, rightfully so. My friends and I were told to always go to a scholarship office and see if we could have applied. I walked in the office and I said, hello. This man said, do not sit down. I hear an accent. Are you from the Bahamas? I said, yes. He said, well, I have nothing for you. Leave. This man never asked me for my student ID because we do have student ID. We do also have students from the Bahamas that were born in the US. This question was never asked to me. Why was this question so important? Because if I was a citizen or a permanent resident at the time, I would have been qualified for some sort of financial aid. but my accent alone disqualified me. But he wouldn't have known because he never asked. Later on, I would see that my friends and I needed internships. Due to the fact that I was an education major, it was required by the state of Florida that I execute 3 internships prior to graduating. However, this was not the case for my friends who were also international students. They did not receive any internships, but at the time we could not figure out why, what was happening. During these internship experiences, I would have learned that my classmates who were US citizen and permanent residents would look just like me were paid while I was not. Due to this, I would have been told that international students were not allowed to work off campus and make any money. I kept noticing that something had to be wrong, that this could not be possible. And I went on for 3 years without being paid, although I participated extensively, just like my colleagues. I started to work in the Office of Admissions. In the admissions, I was excited because I wanted students like myself to have what we considered the American dream, becoming US educated, attending a now Black institution that we found out was very vital to our culture and being able to recognize that. But I started to learn a bit more about the admissions process. Every semester, I would have learned that the GPA to receive a full tuition scholarship kept increasing by 20 points. When I initially started this process, it actually was only a 3.0. By the end of this, by the 3rd semester of me working in this department, I realized that the GPA to receive a full tuition was a 3.6. At the time, I asked the former director, why is it every semester that the GPA would increase? To my surprise, and the shocking answer that came behind and followed, and saying, well, the international students is constantly coming with great GPAs. And if we gave all of them a scholarship, we would be unable to afford it. We would not be able to afford it. Therefore, the GPA was increased that would give a limited opportunity for these students to come on and receive funding. I was in disbelief. I tried to find ways as to where I could figure out how to assist these students. But I was a student myself, limited and understanding all of the ramifications that came with this new persona. I was then placed at a Christian school, a Black Christian private school, where I would have learned my first K through 12, well, the 3rd K through 12 experience. I was excited. I had a great first time with the new administration team. I was excited to get up every day and teach my then new students. Into the 2nd semester, my administration changed over the summer. During this time, I was pulled out of my class, and I was then noticing that on a yearly basis, new teachers would only need to take 3 evaluations. But for me, I had an evaluation at least twice a week. I was then even asked to stay behind after school 1 hour. I was given a dictionary. I was given a thesaurus. And I couldn't figure out why I was given a dictionary and a thesaurus. And I was told to read it. Once I read it, I was asking why was I learning to understand these definitions. I was then told, you need to learn how to speak the American Standard English. These are just a few of the experiences that happened to me just in my Black America with people that looked just like myself. I thought it was just my story. At this point, I still looked at all the positive things that I had accomplished and what had happened for me through my HBCU. And therefore, I recruited over 1,000 students to be in this country at both HBCUs and predominantly white institutions. Well, with 1 year of enrollment, all of the phone calls started to come in. Hey, we're not getting internships. Hey, what's going on? We're not getting the scholarships. And some of the scholarships that we have been given, they would say to us, we ran out of money. You already stated on your document that you could have afforded to be here. So live with that. These students face so many turmoil. My country would get involved where I wrote my country and wrote contracts for these students to also be funded. These students would have paid the same amount of money as any US citizen or permanent resident. They would, and at many of the state schools, they would even pay 3 times as much, 3 times as much. Although we were paying the same amount, probably getting the same grades or even higher, these students would go on to job fairs right on their campuses and would not be able to get jobs. They would be asked, are you able to work in America? No, I need a visa. These students would then respond, well, we cannot assist you. Are there any resources that these students can be able to accompany? These students could not do it as well. Many of these students returned back to my country and other home countries, not gaining any internship experience, or many of them did not receive postgraduate employment, which means that they received a degree, returned back to their country, not being able to contribute to a more effective workforce. Many these complaints started to arise. Hey, these students are coming back. They have a degree, but we have to teach them what to do in the work field. I started to begin to think, what is going on here? Why is this even happening? As I began to research, I would have found many of the tools these students were given were for African American students. All of the resources was to assist African American students. So I began to ask myself, how could this be diversity and inclusion? How could this even be equity? Who was going to hear our voice? Who was going to listen? I then decided to go back in time and remembered in 2014 when my friends were graduating. They were told, you cannot graduate because you did not pass all of the state exams. This was a part of Florida's policy. We begin to ask ourselves, well, if we are only given 1 year, according to the immigration policy, to work after graduation and return back to our country, why are we taking exams that we will not be able to use? Principals are saying that we are not going to hire students for 1 year when we could hire a teacher that can be with us permanently. That would all make sense. So we began to come together. We had a new president. We stopped her on our way out of a conference and said, hey, the group of 2014 are Afro-Caribbean students. They are international. They will be returning back. Why are they subject to taking a Florida exam that they will not be able to use in their home country? The then president said, that doesn't sound right. That sounds a bit strange. Within 1 week, all of the international students got an email saying that you will now be able to graduate. We said, how is that possible? What happened? Did a miracle even take place? That is when we found out that there was another law that stated that you can graduate with a bachelor's degree non-certified, meaning that you will not have a Florida certification, but you can get your degree and use it in your respective country. That was never said to us. It was never a policy that we had even heard of. But we informed our government as to what transpired, only to find out that there were teachers up to 15 years that were working minimum wage jobs all throughout the state of Florida and all throughout the state of South Carolina that graduated from both predominantly white and historically Black college returning back to their respective countries, unable to contribute to the workforce because their degree was never conferred. When we informed them of the new policy that had passed, that graduation students who were still living up to 15 years came back and finally walked across the graduation stage. Again, I asked, how could this be equity and inclusion? But again, we would have seen these people fight in this country. We would have seen the fight for Black Americans to survive, and rightfully so, because this is their homeland. But we also ask ourselves, what happened to our fellow brothers and sisters that were brought from our countries many years ago to help build up South Florida and Florida at large, help with the agriculture in South Carolina and in the state of Georgia, many whom would have never returned back to our homeland, including my grandmother's then husband, who had never returned back, never to be seen again once he came to this place. We too helped build this country in those regions. We too helped the advancement of graduation rates. We too helped to expose and bring scholarship endowment dollars to the institution. In fact, 1 million students are international students in this country. Many of the policies are put in place that are supported for Chinese and Asian and Indian students at large, rightfully so, because they do represent the majority of the population. In 2019 alone, it talked about in a report by Glass Windows Doors that $49 billion were contributed by international students. These international students also are required to pay taxes. They are also required to pay general fees and any other fees that comprise of it. But many of these students cannot get any sort of medical care or Medicaid or anything of that nature. Many of these students did not even know that they were entitled to $1,000 in refund taxes by the US government. Many of these students still to this day went on to go into premature marriages because they could not take on the frustration of what it meant to be eliminated and limited to the resources provided equally to the student body in higher education. Many times, even at my predominantly white institution, where I currently attend, we are overlooked. In fact, because of the culture that we came from and did not know there was a different culture among different states, I brought one of my friends with me from the Bahamas. In a class, we were first told about gender pronouns. She asked, what is a pronoun? How do I use it? What am I using it for? And who is to be using it? And who is using it? It's a valid question when you're from a different culture and not aware of the phenomenon that is going on. She was looked at in dismay. You really don't know what a pronoun is? Are you kidding me? She said no. When she was then told what these pronouns are, she said, well, in my culture, we don't use it. Is it okay if I just use the students or my colleagues' name? They said, no, you need to learn it and use it the right way. After class, we were approached by a white student who then said to us, well, you know, Obama was the one who created it, so I'm sure you voted for him. We looked at each other in disbelief because at the time when President Obama was in office, none of us were even US citizens to even vote. Therefore, we understood that that meant we only voted for the Democratic Party because we were Black. We were alienated. Our grades even played a pivotal role in decrease and demise because of the stereotype that came with being from an Afro-Caribbean region. I say that to say, how long are we going to have to fight and speak up for ourselves? How long will we be able to not sit at the table, but stand? Because when we look at the people who are sitting at the table and are invited to the table, many of these voices are only of US citizen. Many of these voices are permanent resident. And if there is a Black person sitting at the table, it is only an African American, not an Afro Caribbean, not an Afro Latino, or anything like that. Where are our voices? I just ran a pilot study on my tests on 2 different universities to find out, what do our Black international students know about the job search market? Is their resumes culturally understood? Do they know to transform their resumes to the US standard? Do they understand which employers actually help international students? So far in our pilot study, we found that 94% of these students did not know about job search engines that were specifically created for international students. 98% of these students' resumes were still as in their form of their culture as they know it to be, meaning that in the AI system, in the screening system, these students' resumes would not even be picked up. They would be wondering and sitting, why am I not getting a job? Am I not even qualified? Even though I state that I have a degree, many of them did not know that you cannot use images on your resumes like we taught them in our culture. Many of them did not know you're not supposed to put your high school information all the way down to elementary. Many of them did not know that you are to not utilize the British Standard English that we were taught. All of them did not know that. The career centers at none of the institutions that we are pilot studying had any knowledge of cultural awareness. In fact, I can take you to a study by Ramin, who is an Afro-Caribbean woman at the institution of Florida State University, that actually went and did an actual study on Afro-Caribbean US citizen, that meaning people who were born here, Afro-Caribbean descendants, that mean that they were coming from another country or had parents of that descendant, permanent residents who would have probably gained permanent residencies through either marriage, family-based, or employment-based, Afro-Caribbean international students, all the way from pre-graduation, early as freshmen, to post-doctorate students, all had different experiences. And at the bottom of that list, Afro-Caribbean international students were down. Although they all faced discrimination, those set went on because they had US citizenship and permanent residence. There was another study where 6 schools were actually dealing with Afro-Caribbean students in high school. These students continue to fail English because they were not given the resources to state how to speak in the US standard English. When they brought these students to the forefront, they said, we only have resources for students of Esau. And we do not need to have resources for these students. Aren't they Black? Don't they speak English? Without the even impact of understanding the cultural differences. No, we do not understand what it means to be an African American. We will never be able to take on those identities. We understand the historical struggle and the fight that this group of people had to go through in order for us to be able to have a voice in America. But when we are told by African American groups, faculty, and classmates that you cannot speak on Black America because you don't know what it is for this struggle, you grew up in the Afro-Caribbean region where it is impossible for you to understand slavery. It's impossible for you to understand disadvantages. It is impossible. Those words were detrimental. It was disheartening. It was impactful. It was feeling like I was dismembered. And when we speak up, we are told, are you a Republican? When we speak up sometimes, are you a Democrat? And we have to say, well, we are neither. I was even told, you are a white supremacist. I had to go and find out, what is a white supremacist? I was told that I have Western and colonial views, which again was a further slap in my face among my Afro-Caribbean classmates because we were heavily colonialized. We were in a system where our teachers had to read from a book because our government could not afford a textbook for each student. We are in 2024 where our students still in my country don't not know what it is to have internet in the classrooms, where they still share a book, where there are 40 students in a classroom and there's only one fan, where there's still no financial aid and loans to run to, where there is no such thing as food aid and food security and job security for these students. So again, I ask in America and to you all today, what is diversity and inclusion? What is equity? And through what lens does these stand? Thank you very much.
I think we call that a mic drop. Yes, thank you.
Mike.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to both of you. Would like to open up the conversation now. I am sure that each of my colleagues' presentations spurred thoughts and questions. So please feel free to throw them in the chat or to just step out. Go ahead, Dr. Hodge. I see your hand.
Yeah. You know, people call her Ali. I would never figure out how to pronounce it, so I call her Aleandra. She always doesn't want to call her by a full government name, so I call her Aleandra Pinder. But that was fair because she called me Pop or Dad or whatever she called me, because her father came up, met her father and her mother, and they said thank you so much for looking out because as you just saw. Listen, I let me mess with the American grammar for a minute. I ain't never had nothing like that in my life. But I think our first conversation about these matters was during the pandemic. So let me be clear. So I'm Afro-Caribbean and I'm also African American and I'm also Black. Um, my Afro-Caribbean is because I was born in St. Thomas, but African American is United States Virgin Islands. So I was born with citizenship, and so therefore I had different experiences from my siblings. The last four of us were born in the Virgin Islands, and the other I don't know the math, but a lot more to get to 12. They were born in the British Caribbean, and so therefore their experience would have been a lot like Aleandra. And when my family moved like 1958, 59, 60 from St. Kitts to St. Thomas, they underwent a whole lot of the discrimination that Aleandra is talking about. The only difference is as opposed to what Brandon was talking about, the optics were quite literally different because and I see Dr. Abdallah raising her hand. I'm so glad that Dr. Abdallah's here, so we'll get you in. Ashanti Ali, can you let her in, please, so she could ask the question? But I was quite my family experienced exactly what Aleandra experienced to the point where Brandon they couldn't go to public schools because they were from the British Caribbean. They were called Brito, as it would be the same as Kaffir in South America or nigger in the United States. So that language, so they grew up under that stigma, and I think which was one of the terms that Dr. Wyland Wilson spoke about earlier. You know, kind of growing up under that stigma and what it means to have it over your head. But now it's not done by whiteness. It was done by blackness. And now, so Aleandra then left blackness in the Bahamas. And we didn't know, I grew up in the Virgin Islands, I didn't know what the heck racism was. Because everybody saw us black in the tourists, they were minorities, they would come and go. And when I went to American Baptist College in Nashville, everything that she just said, I could underscore. They told me about how I came, what was it like when the first time I saw a um a street light. Did I say, is that a moon on a stick? You know, what was the what was it like when I was riding on a gorilla or elephant and then catching a crocodile or alligator to swim across the Atlantic? And you know, yeah, that's funny, but if you hear it, if you hear it over and over and over, it becomes really repulsive. And to the point that Aleandra's making, um, um, at Florida Memorial University, the numbers that she just gave were extremely accurate, but there's another accuracy that she may not have had that was privy to, and that is 33% of the student body came from the Caribbean. So one of the things that the university has maintained for years was to keep, as a private school, to keep, as expensive as it was as a private school, but to keep the tuition low because so many people like Aleandra paying out of pocket. Can you imagine a Jamaican student paying 70 to $1? You know, I don't even know what the numbers are now. Those are more than 100, but back then it was 70. What, a Haitian student? Could you imagine what it takes for a Haitian student to come, right? And it's just, I think Bahamas is 1 to 1, but still, when you're a Bahamian student and your parents have to pay 20, 30, 40,000 annually to support your child, it was incredible. Now, that was bad enough, but the other struggle was um, uh, um, so they had full scholarships, like Ali just talked about, for sports. They started a baseball team and a soccer team. 90% of those on the baseball team and on the soccer team were from South America, Latinos. Which, of course, now who's going to turn down that opportunity to actually say get an American education? But what that meant was that the African American or the Caribbean black students, they were now eliminated because they couldn't hit a baseball or they couldn't kick soccer ball, whatever you call it. So then now you're pitted against because now, like, once again, so you have those, but this is only people of color now because you have the black students saying, wait, I have a 3.8 GPA or 3.6 GPA and I'm from the Bahamas, but I can't get a scholarship. But this person and this is a HBCU, but this person comes from somewhere else, and this is not a black student, but that person can get a scholarship. Then it got worse. So one professor asked, wait a minute, can you not find any students in Africa who could kick a ball or hit a ball? So then we had these kinds of tensions on HBCU campuses. So the challenges are significant like that, but there's another challenge, and that's the challenge of mental health. Ms. Pender just pointed out something that was, and she and I know of more than a few students who actually had to marry to stay here to get a job. Now, I'm not going to call the words that you all would actually know that I'm imagining now, but this is what persons had to do just to be able to stay here and complete their education. Otherwise, what happens the moment that your parents cannot pay? So now the question I'm going to ask Aleandra, because I think that was just such a brilliant presentation, absolutely brilliant presentation. Thank you so much, masterful. The question I have for you is, you just presented us with a paper to publish on what you're writing. And I think what you wrote about is germane to this conversation because it deals with inclusivity with respect to image of NCAA athletes. Can you at least share summarily what that meant, what that paper was about, so that we could get a good handle on other aspects of this massive problem? Oh, I didn't finish what I said. Back to COVID. There goes your cat, Shannon. So I was let me say this part. What Aleandra brought to my attention during COVID was, do you recall when I think it was on the yeah, it was, of course it was on the President Trump, when they were sending back or cutting off students and sending back to India or China or wherever, because you're here for a certain amount of time, but now there's COVID and schools are shutting down, and what do you do? So they're stuck. How they just paid $5,000 to get here. What do they do now? So Alejandro, because I wasn't thinking along those lines. What do you do now when the laws don't change to expand your time, but a pandemic shuts down your time? So there's a lot of things going on there, and the mental health crisis that could come as a result by what is placed upon these students are immense. Aleandra, speak to particularly to the NCAA, and then we could go further.
So, thank you for that. So for the NCAA, of course, we were all excited for the NIL policy, name, image, and likeness for student athletes to be paid, and which was, we felt it's an awesome opportunity because, you're making the school millions of dollars and you can't get paid from it, which was excellent. But then I began to think, I said, hold on, we also have international student athletes and who are doing extremely well and also bringing in the same ticket sales and jersey sales and stuff like that, not necessarily promoted as much as in the media as they would be in their home country. But these students cannot get paid due to the immigration law, that students supposedly cannot work. And so I then began to look at two separate laws, which was the NCAA law that says all student athletes can be paid, but then also looking at the federal law that says international students can't. And so when you have two laws combating each other, I wanted to know then, how our institution itself dealing with these particular things? When I looked at two schools that were both Research One, both Division One, and both in the same state, they were treating the international students different at both universities. And when I say that, right, so we have something called CPT, that allows students to work up to 20 hours a week to receive paid internships. Now, this law was out even when I was an undergrad student, which is why I still can't figure out why I wasn't paid doing my internships and was told I could not. But we also have something called a PA visa for professional athletes. The minute someone receives any sort of income for being an athlete, you are no longer an amateur in this. You can be paid. And once you can be paid, you can then qualify for that professional athlete visa. So I begin to ask, why is an institution taking their international students' F1 status and transferring it over to the P visa that will allow these students to go to school and be able to be compensated? Many of these institutions were not doing that. What they were doing is the funding that these students were receiving um, from the jerseys and all of that were going paid towards their tuition. Now, the domestic student has tuition and is being compensated, while the international student is not. That was one part of it. The domestic student can say, I will go to class fully online because I'm so popular and I can't be dealing with all the fans and notion, while despite the international students' popular status in that community, are subject to going to class, to physically go into class 12 or more credits per semester. The other thing with that is international students are only allowed to take one online class due to a policy that was written almost over 25 years ago, when the first, not the second, bombing in New York with the Twin Towers, the first incident where they found a former international student on an expired visa was an assailant in that. So here we are, all paying the price for what one international student did. But in the same breath, we then say, well, we can't treat all Muslim countries alike. We can't treat all because of one incident that is completely wrong to do that. And I agree that it is wrong, but then you justify it on international students. And so that's what I saw in the culture of the NIL policy deals, that even now, international students are still being disadvantaged. But what they say is, okay, we want you to advertise us in your own home country because that is a door for other students to be recruited. We will use you as an ambassador. We will wait for you to get it physically into your home country, and then we'll give you a few dollars, and that would be a part of your compensation. To me, I can't believe that I'm not seeing a lot more um, research papers published on this type of thing, but I do see qualitative articles by probably one or two international students saying that they are the ghosts in the classroom. They are the ghosts. They are of starting five, but they are the ghosts on the court. Imagine how they feel internally, where these students are hoping for every dollar that they get to probably send home to help with their family, every dollar that they get to eat outside of the cafeteria, the funding that they can get probably to even try to get their hair done or something like that. We have these athletes that are personally telling you, I am struggling mentally, but I am having to work 5 times as harder than any other student in my class or any other student on the court because of an immigration status. And I pull in just as much or more than a regular domestic student. And I have friends that what I grew up with, that I went to high school with. They are in the NBA right now, WNBA right now, and they could not touch an NIL deal. They could not touch their first dollar until leaving the country for a new visa to return on the professional athletic visa to receive their first dollar, and all of those money being spent paying for their visas. I mean, their athletic wear. Nothing went to their families. Nothing went to them. Only being told you are playing and you get an education in exchange.
Thank you so much for that thorough answer. And really, it opens us up to even more important understandings of the implications around policy and how they're applied. You mentioned individual institutions and you mentioned individual people making decisions, and that's exactly where we started from, is around this area, this concept of DEI, how it's being approached. The next question I would love to have Dr. Abdallah. I know you have a question. There's a couple more in the chat as well. So if we could go to you next. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This is great talks. And I'm sorry I couldn't really follow up all of it because I was really engaged with my student. I was in and out. Maybe what I'm going to ask is already been answered, but I want to take this opportunity to ask, this is great, talking about what our, even African American or immigrant they are facing in terms of disparities. So I am very interested to see now new technology that can be used to help improve, reduce, and or eliminate this kind of disparities. How do we can use artificial intelligence that can really help us, in terms of all, Dr. Alexander, she just, just mentioned. And even I think previously, even yesterday, I think some of the session, I hear a lot of things in this term. It is very good technology. And I want to see what is the benefit and if there is any kind of, disadvantages, I really want to see those things. So I can apply it because I work with, I work here with the Black Belt counties in my focus with cervical cancer regarding, and there is a lot of disparities, our people here facing a lot of disparity. Myself, I would like to get the benefit to learn how I can use this new technology that can help me to help in the reducing and or eliminating this kind of disparities.
I think it's a really important question. And I know we've had other conversations about it over the course of the week. Does anyone on the panel or anyone with their screen on want to comment in that space? As I talked about at the beginning, I think there are a lot of questions. There's a burgeoning area of research around this question. And that old saying that I really don't love too much, but the whole idea of garbage in, garbage out, I think it applies in a new and different way to artificial intelligence and how it's approached. Because as we all know, the algorithms shape our experience online for us, right? So the way that math is used and ultimately determines the frames through which we're seeing things. And for so many of us, and for so many of the young people we're working with, for so many people across generations, that's not something we're trained to even begin to grapple with or to ask about. And so then at the same time, so many people across this our call today are extraordinarily expert in the work that they do, the science that they conduct, the philosophy, the areas of philosophy or other areas of academic expertise that they're in, the medicine that they practice, the law that they practice, and so forth. The educational expertise that we have in Dr. Isome and Dr. Dr. Pinder. I would like to confer, by the way, the Ph.D. today for you. But all of that is to say, it's really important that we, in our areas of expertise, recognize our own biases and how those biases get reinforced by the tech that we're using, and how we then challenge that amongst our students, and at the tables where we sit, and the places where the people who are leading in our field are having discussions about what is and isn't examined, what is and isn't put forward, how policies are implemented and how they're not implemented. It was Ms. Pender's example was perfect. It was a perfect example of, you have one school where people are being treated one way with the same policy in place, and you have another school where people are completely treated a different way. And ultimately, the impact on the individuals means their experience on a day-to-day basis and their family's experience of whether or not they can even have the basic needs met is critical. So I don't know that that helps or answers your question, but I think we have to
Absolutely.
consider.
Absolutely, because I think this is a very big topic. We can keep talking, there is a lot of factors.
Absolutely.
And I think together, I think our knowledge, our experience is very important, that we can share, what other people they share there. That's really helps. It definitely will help me to apply that in my research, that really to solve some of this problem. Of course, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Abdallah, I think I have a response again, but can you ask the question? I want to make sure I had exactly the short version of your question. I think Dr. Abdallah?
Yes, you said the question again?
Can you ask the question again? Because I think I have a response. I want to make sure I hit all the points you asked.
Yeah, actually, I'm talking about the disparities, because you see, I work with this Blackville County for many years. I saw a lot of disparities, either if you are international student or even our African-American student, even our senior citizen, in regard of many diseases, that they are really even dying of that, it shouldn't be, it's curable, like cervical cancer. Why our African they are dying? The screening rate is higher, but again, the mortality is even higher. So there is a gap here. So my question, how do I utilize this new powerful technology like artificial intelligence to help me to improve or reduce or even eliminate this kind of disparities? I really love to use the technology. I love even to teach my community the basic technology that can help them to help us to collect some data if there is any crisis like what happened with COVID-19. We don't like nobody to be disabled, to navigate or provided information that can help us to solve these problems.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I think I have a response, because everything you said cut across about 4 or 5 of the different conversations we've been having. Among them was a moment ago with Dr. Wyland Wilson and the notion of proximity. What it means to be up close and in front, and see people as human, to use what Nathaniel Holmes' language from the other day. Additionally, from Paul and Root Whoopi and John Benja yesterday, they do forthrightly acknowledge, as we all do, that the level of implicit bias becomes explicit bias when we move with unregulated assumptions. As a matter of fact, that's the point Aleandra Pinder was trying to make earlier, that by virtue of her accent, there were so many assumptions made about her race, religion, creed, ethnicity, culture, all because of her accent. And just so you, Dr. Abdallah, if perhaps didn't have on, wasn't wearing your hijab, and just see you at Piggly Wiggly, then the straightforward answer is that you are a black woman from Alabama, right? When there's so much more to you, you're from the Sudan, you from Sudan, you have so much going on. There's so many more going on there. So I think then it comes down to something that our dear brother Lachlan said yesterday and before, and in our private conversations. I think and the question goes back to and Dr. Donna, what you're pushing me, David Hart, personally on is what can the National Center do? And here's I think is a window opportunity. Um, uh, we Lachlan says, not ask us what, and not leave it up to those who are putting together the engineering and so on to to filter the assumptions. That could never happen because you don't know what you're filtering. You don't know which part of you have these particular biases. So that it has to be more than that. But as Brandon just spoke to, and as Lachlan always says, how about from the bottom up? In other words, rather than telling folk what they are and what their sickness is all about and how they feel or how they should feel, we need to go to the community. And not it's not in Macon County, but Judea, Samaria, and all those parts of the world. We need to expand by going to. Let me say that again. We need to expand by going to and have the conversation and ask the questions so that we'll be making less assumptions. So much of what we do with this wonderful group that I'm working with, I should say, um, in terms of suicide prevention and trying to understand algorithms of Black young men. They said, well, here's what we'll do. We'll start in Ohio and we'll run our program set there. And then after we've gotten some successes, then we move to Indiana or, stay around the Midwest until you kind of expand. So I asked the question, which part of Ohio has a Cameroon community? So I don't know. Which part of has a Nigerian community? And just because they look black or are black or African, that doesn't mean they have the same kind of algorithms because they have been raised in a totally different kind of thing. So the question is Shannon. Shannon just was it Shannon who showed the table just now? Was it you who showed the table? Whoever it was that showed the table, yeah. The question of is who is the language of inviting to the table is in of itself hierarchical, right? So we have to think as David Tracy said, more in terms like polycentrics, right? Where we have everyone, every human being is a part of this conversation, and we got to think about not just the Macon County and not just Black folk, because as I said time and time again, there are. I live in Noonan, Georgia. My white neighbor down the street and their children probably have more in common with my children than black community, black people in Liberty City or in West Atlanta or so on. So we have these artificial variables that we keep imposing on people. So we have to think longer and deeper. And the way to do it is, and I pass it on now to Lachlan, because the way to do it, Lachlan, is to go into the communities and start having the conversation by asking the questions.
Can I
Like,
just comment
oh,
quick
yeah.
on what you said? I really appreciate what you have said now because I even teach my student about that. Going to the Black Belt counties, communicate with the community. I can see, as you said, not only Black, but even if you location can put you that you know in trouble, you'll be also practicing some kind of disparities because located living in Alabama, you see there is lack of healthcare facilities and services. Regardless your really race, you may also get to suffer, to get some help. Thank you. I think we have to take care of all of that to work together to reduce or eliminate this kind of disparity. Thank you.
Thank you. As Lachlan referred to yesterday when he said Black bioethics, and I didn't speak to it again. And since it's the last, I'll just say this one sentence: Black bioethics is less about pigmentation and more about identification. It's about identification. Is what Black is protest. and whoever want to be part of that protest conversation, be it womanist, be it Latino, be it Jewish bioethics, as with Paul Wolpe and others, whoever needs to be a part of that protest from the bottom up, Brandon, that's where we need to be. Okay, Lachlan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because we're nearing the end, want to go back to the beginning that Shannon started with, and the images of a table and seats at the table and share of the pie, and framing, how important framing is, and a plea in everything we're doing. A whole lot of the issues here are only problems because we are framing things in zero-sum ways and in terms of scarcity. And if we looked at everything as an opportunity for a win-win plus sum, Kiera Haynes in the Q&A talked about expanding the table, multiplying the tables, and larger pies, or actually more pies, then I think there are lots of win-win opportunities here. For Dr. Hodge, question, there isn't time to get into detail. I believe that if you and other colleagues at Tuskegee University, hearing the powerful testimony from Aleandra Pinder, but also knowing that there are almost limitless numbers of young people, students in the Caribbean, in Africa, and other places, that not only could benefit from education Tuskegee University currently offers or could be offering with AI tools online, but by connecting with the students and faculty at Tuskegee University, those relationships would enrich the lives of every student and faculty member at Tuskegee University. And there are countless local businesses and others in this country, I believe, that if we were developing the right kind of systems helped by AI, for which modern internship opportunities for international students and others could connect those to internship opportunities here in this country, which wouldn't be a zero-sum, oh, they took that away from American students, but in fact would enrich everybody's lives, connections, and relationships. So I just want to plea for going back to where we started, how powerful framing is. And as long as we frame things as zero-sum and slices of a fixed pie or seats at a table that has limited seats, we're going to have hopeless fights. And if we can use just a little bit more imagination, and the ways in which AI tools can help us make that imagination concretely real, including starting at Tuskegee University or from Tuskegee University, I think the conversations will be very different.
I want to do two things if I can, since I know we're right at the end, and I'm supposed to be moderating, though you all are doing just fine on your own. Dr. Isome, I wanted to let you respond. Dr. Pinder, I wanted to let you respond, and then I actually, to Dr. Furrow's point, to Lachlan's point, I have one more image that I created for this session that is to do with the limitless. So we'll leave on that point, but go ahead, Dr. Isome, any last words? I know there are a couple of great questions there, so maybe we can share emails or share content. You gave us so much great stuff, but I'd love to hear your closeout, Ms. Pinder, and then I'll share the image.
No, I'm good. I don't have a closeout. I'm enjoying the international conversation, so I'm good.
I'm with you. Same here. And Ms. Pinder.
Yeah, so I wanted to say, because I did see borrow your question in the chat about U.S. citizen and permanent resident and stuff like that. So basically, I want to say no. Students or anybody, I should say, born in this country or receive permanent residence, I do, without a shadow of a doubt, believe they are entitled to every and anything above someone who is not a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. That includes anybody migrating and stuff like that. So I get it in terms of the financial aid and all of those things. Yes, I will never, because I don't want anybody from outside of my country coming in there and I'm seeing them get this thing over me and stuff like that. So what I'm basically saying in this aspect is when I was told to prepare to come to this country, I was expected that I would have been discriminated or have some sort of racism from white America. I completely was prepared, got my mind conditioned. In African American history, they literally conditioned us for those to deal with that, right? And so, in fact, I was scared to come to a PWI because I was conditioned to, oh my God, I'm going to face this. So, what I'm seeing at a PW now, I understood that what I did not prepare myself for was to deal with that in the African or Black American community. And so what I'm saying is if my people are paying for the same amount of education and my country is paying for that education and the US to my country is promoting that, hey, we're going to do a cultural exchange of education. They come here, they get to get our culture involved, and when they return, they can bring back that knowledge to help advance. But when I see that there's only a one-way street going on here, that you are receiving the cultural exchange, our brain, our research, our work ethic that comes along with whatever it is to make the school look good or make the employers look even better. And we are at the bottom of that benefit field. I had an issue with those type of behaviors. The other thing that I would say is it plays a legal issue straight across the board by both parties. And why I'm saying that, I will go back to pronouns, where we have a variety of pronouns that can be used, right, for different categories of people who identify and have the free will to do that. International students do not have that privilege. When you go to the international website and you look at all the countries and stuff like that from these students, when they say gender, it's male and female only. That is it. There's no such thing as I coming through the border patrol and telling them, well, I named Bobby today, but my passport says Brittany, and I'm demanding that you respect that. You will not be able to enter this country whatsoever by that border. And so it is these type of situations that we are not allowed to do, and we cannot do it because you are not a citizen or not a permanent resident to have those type of privilege. Last but not least, down to our CIP codes, and when I say CIP codes, the academic programs codes. When my country sends someone here for math education, they are under the impression that is STEM. Of course, we know math education to be STEM, but US immigration, USCIS, does not consider that STEM whatsoever. If it's not innovation, research, or anything that falls in that category, it is not STEM. So when my country thinking that we are giving our students the STEM component to thrive, that is not happening because that language conversation of what is your definition of STEM for an international student is not being told. And so what we have schools are doing is, and when I say schools, let me be clear, the predominantly white schools are ahead of the game in this area because an economic degree was not considered STEM. It was not. But the PWIs found a nice little hole in that and say, wait, immigration is now considering economics to be a STEM component. So what did they do? Change their CIP code from the regular one to the STEM code, causing all kind of international students to leave their respective institution, run here to receive the benefits that President Obama had put into place of the 3-year employment benefit, while the HBCUs were not changing that at a faster rate. Many of the students where these Afro-Caribbean students are going to, they are on a regular Bachelor's of Economic program, not receiving that 1-year benefit. Then they said, well, if you get a Ph.D., we will, and it's a research-based school, we will then be able to give you permanent residency based on that degree alone. Well, guess what? Only 5 HBCUs are listed as a research too. That means my fellow Bahamians or Jamaicans or Haitians that go to Barry University and get a doctorate degree in some sort of Ph.D. program are now limited because that school doesn't have the research component that the government is asking for. So again, there's another layer of weeding us out. If you go to the website, and I play around with the immigration website, where I was able to find something called the CBIS mapping tool, where they are literally finding where each international student enrolled into a STEM program is. And majority of those students are mapped to target them. Those are the students that we want to remain in this country. Those are the ones that we are getting. And they know exactly which school they are, which state they are, the numbers, the gender gap, and where to find them. And as they read those mapping tools, they then continue to change policy to support that. But guess what? The research are not being done on the Afro-Caribbean area because they represent only less than 1%. And so again, we find ourselves in a race struggling to compete in an area that we should have never been competing for when we are paying our money equally like anybody else and getting the grades. By the way, and I have a niece, I want to put this out there. She's graduating in 2 weeks, completely debt-free, 4.0 cumulative GPA. I have 4 nieces and nephews in this country. 2 were citizens born in this country because their father say, you know what, I don't want my children to go through what the other international students will go through, because he was here as an international student. My sister and I, who was unaware of that privilege, did not have them here. So I have 2 that are international students. 4 people come from my lineage having 2 completely different experiences and opportunities based on citizenship. So
thank
yes.
you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists and everyone who spoke and everyone who shared. There's a lot of great comments in the open comment section. I'll make sure we'll make sure that that's included with the recordings. Thank you, Ms. Ellie Davis, for letting us know that the recordings will all be available. But yes, absolutely. I agree. We need to expand our understanding of what is inclusion, and we need to this has challenged me to continue to think about, and I hope all of us to continue to think about that expansion, that idea of seeking to end limitations in the way that we think about what is inclusion and how we are going to ensure that we go beyond the metaphors of the table. We go beyond the metaphors. I wanted to say thanks for and at the very least, we expand of this or make this very important work. So my last to all prompt of the national bioethics system that I used, the generator that I used, for to Dr. Hodge for your vision, and to Dr. Farrow for your vision inclusion. And here's what came up. I'll let you close out. In infinite inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say, Lachlan, Sister Lassie, do you have anything close out to say? Lachlan, ladies and gentlemen, he is the co-chair of the Advisory Council for the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare, as we seek to find another a female co to be in that position. And he's just a tremendous support. Ashanti Ali Davis, he come on live for the screen for the first time. And he is our, thank you, Ashanti Ali. He's our behind the scenes technical person. Ashanti Ali, give us quickly tomorrow for the banquet. Can you share what time is the banquet tomorrow? Do you have that on you? The information?
Starts at 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you give me 1 second, I can pull up the flyer.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, thank you each and everyone. Thank you each and everyone for your presence here today. Brandon, as Aleandra was speaking, that the last floor. Okay, yes, Ashanti.
Also, for those who wish to attend, you will be using the same link that you've been using this entire week. So you don't need to register or get any other link. It's the same link.
Okay, tomorrow at 1 Central Time. And so thank you so much. And Ashanti, I was saying, Brandon, Brandon, as Aleandra gave that last flurry, the only thing that came to me was Brandon has a lot of work to do. because your PhD in policy, and this is why we have this section, because I said on the first day, if all we do is talking about this thing, we're just rapping. We're just chatting. But now the question is, and so next section, next thing we do, we got to start with policy. How do we do policy? How do we get these things into thing? Because Aleandra Pinder just gave us a whole lot of what's called dilemmas, legal dilemmas, which are now moral dilemmas, right? Because they're absolutely conflicting. And so therefore, we're thankful to each of you. I want to thank each of you. Once again, I want to thank my colleagues at the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, Norman Hayes, and Dr. Yamir. I want to thank also my colleagues at Primer, Harvard, Vanderbilt, Emory, University of Texas, and Cal State, and Shannon and Lachlan and Kevin Lee and Belinda Thorpe um, and Dr. Ebo, and all of those who come together to make this happen. I want to thank Dr. Gwen West. She's the one who put together our flyers and such. So I thought thank Dr. West for putting that stuff together. And once again, each of you, thank you so much. This year's PHEI has been incredible. I'm exhausted. Absolutely exhausted. And tomorrow is the banquet. And then guess what do? On Monday, we start out over again. We have to fight for the least, the lost, and the left out. There's a 13-year-old girl in Kenya, or Ukraine, or Gaza, or Israel, or Colombia, whom we do not know. She's in Sudan. She's down in Georgia. She is 13 years old. She's a metaphor for any child who we do not know. But if we give the butterfly effect, if we flap our wings, Dr. Abdallah, like what you're doing in the black belt, if we flap our wings really, really fast, and what you do with cervical cancer research, and that language just come out of Alabama and go to Georgia and New York and the rest of the world, we will be making an impact for the least, the lost, and the left out people who used to be called, as Lachlan said, third world countries, and now we call them what? Something about no resource countries, shallow resource, whatever we call them. We are always making up a name, but the question is this: what are we going to do for our brothers and sisters who may or may not look like us or sound like us? Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, peace, shalom, and blessings upon you. We shall see you in less than a year because we have several other programs coming along. Take care.